I booked the Airbnb for 4 nights while I attended a training course in another city. I was traveling alone, but I wasn't particularly worried about it. The apartment was in a normal residential building, close to shops and a busy road. The listing had hundreds of reviews, and the host had been using the property for years. It felt safer than staying in a cheap hotel. The host sent me the check-in instructions that afternoon. There was a lockbox outside the building containing one key. I let myself in, went up to the 3rd floor, and found the apartment without any problem. It was small, but clean. A kitchen near the entrance, a bathroom on the left, a living room with a sofa and television. The bedroom was at the end of a short hallway. I remember checking the front door lock twice. Then I laughed at myself. I wasn't in some isolated cabin. I was in the middle of an apartment building, with neighbors on both sides. I unpacked, ordered dinner, and called my sister. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. I followed the same routine. I left in the morning, came back in the evening, made something to eat, watched television, and went to sleep. Then, on the 3rd morning, I noticed the bathroom mirror was streaked with water. I hadn't showered. At first, I thought it was leftover condensation. Maybe the cleaner had been there before I arrived and hadn't wiped it properly. I didn't give it much thought. That afternoon, I returned from my course and noticed one of my kitchen chairs had been pulled away from the table. Again, not a huge thing. Maybe I had done it. I was tired. I had been rushing out that morning. I pushed the chair back and forgot about it. That night, my sister called me on video. She had her 5-year-old son with her, and he kept trying to take the phone. Eventually, she gave it to him. He looked at me through the screen and started asking about my apartment. I turned the camera around and showed him the living room. Then, he suddenly became quiet. "Who's that?" I turned the phone back toward myself. "What?" "The man." My stomach tightened. "What man?" He pointed toward the screen. "The one behind the sofa." I looked behind me. Nobody. My sister immediately took the phone back. "He's just trying to scare you," she said. And maybe he was. But I didn't sleep well after that. Before going to bed, I locked the front door and placed one of the kitchen chairs against it. It wasn't a perfect security system. I just wanted something that would make noise if the door opened. I woke up around 3:30 a.m. The first thing I noticed was the hallway light. I had turned it off. The second thing I noticed was that I could hear water running, very quietly, from the bathroom. I stayed in bed for several seconds, listening. Then, the water stopped. I reached for my phone. I called the police without turning on the bedroom light. While I was speaking quietly to the dispatcher, I heard a floorboard creak outside my room. Then another. Someone was walking slowly down the hallway. I slid off the bed and locked myself inside the bedroom. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I could see a shadow underneath it. Someone was standing there. The dispatcher asked me if I could see the person. I whispered, "No." Then, the door handle moved. Once. Twice. The person didn't force the door. They just stood there. Then, I heard them walk away. A few seconds later, there was a loud crash from the front of the apartment. The chair had fallen. I ran to the bedroom window, climbed onto the small fire escape, and waited for the police. They arrived within minutes. Inside the apartment, they found no one. But the front door was unlocked. The chair had been moved. And on the bathroom sink was a wet handprint. The police checked the building cameras. A man had entered the building behind another resident earlier that night. He had apparently been walking through the corridors for hours. The police never confirmed how he entered my apartment. The host later admitted that the previous owner had kept several copies of the key. Nobody knew how many were still unaccounted for. I checked out that morning. I still think about the moment my nephew asked me who was behind the sofa. Maybe he was joking. Maybe he wasn't. But what bothers me most is something else. I had believed I was safe because I had locked the door. I just hadn't considered that someone else might already have a key. The second story was shared by a mother who rented an old house with her husband and young daughter for a weekend getaway. My husband, our daughter, and I rented a house for a weekend trip. Our daughter was 7 at the time, and she was excited about staying somewhere new. The house was old, but well maintained. It had wooden floors, a large kitchen, and a small garden behind it. There was also a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. The host told us it led to an attic and wasn't part of the rental. "It stays locked," she said. And it did. The first day was completely normal. We bought groceries, cooked dinner, and watched a movie in the living room. Before bed, I checked on our daughter. She was sitting upright under her blanket. "What's wrong?" I asked. She pointed toward the ceiling. "Someone is walking up there." I almost laughed. The house only had 1 floor, in the attic above us. I told her old houses make noises. Wood expands, pipes move, animals get onto roofs. She accepted that explanation. The next morning, she seemed fine. My husband and I forgot about it. Until lunchtime. I was walking past the attic door when I noticed it wasn't completely shut. There was a small gap. I called my husband. "Did you open this?" He said no. I tried the handle. Locked. I pushed the door closed until it clicked into place. That evening, our daughter refused to go upstairs alone. She said she had heard something scratching behind the attic door. I thought she was becoming frightened because of what she'd said the night before. So I walked her upstairs and showed her the locked door. "See?" I said. "Nothing can get out." I wish I hadn't said that. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was rain. Then I realized it was footsteps. Slow footsteps. Directly above our bedroom. My husband woke up too. We both listened. The steps continued for several seconds, then stopped. I sat up. "Can you hear that?" He nodded. We turned on the light. Silence. The next morning, I found something near the attic door. A small plastic wrapper. Like the kind used for a snack. It definitely hadn't been there before. I messaged the host. She told me nobody had access to the attic except her maintenance worker. She said it was probably an old wrapper that had fallen from somewhere. That didn't make much sense, but I wanted an explanation. So, I accepted it. That night, our daughter woke up screaming. My husband and I ran into her room. She was crying and pointing at the air vent near the ceiling. "He's looking at me." I felt my entire body go cold. My husband moved the bed away from the wall. There was nothing visible. But when he looked closely at the vent, he noticed one of the screws was missing. We called the police. While we waited downstairs, we heard a loud sound from above. Then another. Like someone moving quickly. My husband told me to take our daughter outside. I grabbed her and ran to the car. We waited with the doors locked. The police arrived and searched the house. Inside the attic, they found blankets, food containers, bottles of water, and clothing. Someone had been living there. There was a narrow opening connecting the attic to a neighboring section of the property. The person was gone, but there was a clear view through the damaged vent into our daughter's room. We left immediately. Our daughter didn't understand what had happened. She just kept asking if the man upstairs was gone. We never told her there really had been someone there. For months afterward, I kept thinking about that first night. When she told me someone was walking above her, I had told her it was just the house making noises. Sometimes children notice things before adults do. And sometimes the explanation we choose is only comforting, because the truth is worse. The third story was shared by a woman who was visiting a friend and decided to rent a small Airbnb for a few days. At first, it seemed like the perfect place to stay. It was a basement apartment underneath a family's home. The listing described it as private. Separate entrance, private bathroom, private kitchen. Exactly what I wanted. The host met me outside and showed me around. She was friendly and talked a lot. Before leaving, she pointed at a small black device on a shelf in the living room. "That's the Wi-Fi router," she said. I didn't question it. The first night was fine. The second day, I noticed something strange. My phone had a notification showing that a new device was connected to the apartment's Wi-Fi. I ignored it. I assumed it belonged to the host. Later that evening, I called my friend. While I was talking, she suddenly asked, "Why do you keep looking over there?" I hadn't realized I was. I kept glancing toward the black device on the shelf. Something about it bothered me. After the call, I looked closer. It wasn't a router. There was a tiny lens on the front. I felt sick. I unplugged it. Nothing happened. No alarm. No message from the host. I decided not to accuse anyone without knowing what it was. So I plugged it back in. Then I placed a book in front of it. About 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the host. "Is everything okay with the Wi-Fi?" I stared at the screen. I hadn't mentioned the Wi-Fi. I replied that everything was fine. Then I picked up my bag and went to the bedroom. That's when I noticed my bedroom door was open. I was sure I had closed it. Inside, my suitcase was on the floor. My clothes were scattered beside it. I hadn't left it like that. I immediately called my friend. While I was explaining what happened, she went quiet. "Get out," she said. "What?" "Don't pack. Just leave." I told her I was probably overreacting. Then she said, "The host just messaged you about the Wi-Fi, right after you covered that device." That was when it finally made sense. I grabbed my shoes. As I walked toward the front door, I heard movement above me. The apartment ceiling creaked. Then I heard footsteps coming down a staircase. The entrance to the main house was on the other side of the basement wall. Someone was coming down. I didn't wait. I opened the door and ran outside. I called the police from the pavement. They arrived and inspected the apartment. The device in the living room was a camera. The police also found another small camera facing the bedroom doorway. The host claimed she knew nothing about them. I don't know what happened after that, but I never went back inside. The thing that still bothers me is that the cameras weren't hidden particularly well. They were sitting in plain sight. I had looked directly at them when I arrived. I just didn't see what they really were. Sometimes you don't notice danger because it's hidden. Other times, it's right in front of you and you simply don't know what you're looking at. The fourth story is about a man who rented a small cottage for 5 days because he wanted to be completely alone. By the end of his stay, he wasn't sure if he ever was. I rented a small cottage by myself for 5 days. I needed a break from work and wanted somewhere quiet. The cottage was outside a small town, but it wasn't completely isolated. There were other houses nearby, just far enough away that you couldn't really see into their windows. The host gave me a tour when I arrived. Everything seemed normal. Near the kitchen was a small door underneath the staircase. I assumed it was a storage cupboard. The host mentioned it before I could ask. "Just storage," he said. "It's locked. You won't need anything in there." I didn't care. The first day was peaceful. I read, cooked, and went for a walk. That night, I heard a faint sound from the kitchen. A soft tapping noise. I went downstairs. Nothing. The small door under the stairs was closed. I went back to bed. The next morning, I noticed a coffee mug in the sink. I hadn't used it. I stood there, looking at it for several seconds. Then I remembered there were 2 mugs in the cupboard. Maybe I had used that one and forgotten. It sounded reasonable, so I washed it. That evening, I made pasta. I opened the fridge and noticed the container of milk was lower than I remembered. Again, I dismissed it. Maybe I had used more than I thought. I began noticing things like that every day. A cupboard left open. A chair slightly moved. A light switched on in the hallway. Nothing major. Nothing I could prove. On the 4th day, my sister called me. She had her young daughter with her. My niece asked if I could show her the cottage. So I walked around with my phone. When I entered the kitchen, she saw the small door underneath the stairs. "What's in there?" "Just storage," I said. She stared at it. Then she said, "Why is that man sleeping in there?" I stopped. My sister laughed. My niece sometimes said strange things to get attention. I laughed too. But my hands were shaking. I told them I had to go. Then I stood in the kitchen, listening. Nothing. I walked toward the small door. The handle was cold. I checked the lock. It was still in place. I backed away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the sofa with every light on. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A faint clicking sound. From inside the door. I stood up. Then, the sound came again. Click. 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 The handle moved slightly. I ran to the front door and opened it. Then, I stopped. I had left my car keys upstairs. I had no choice but to go back. I ran upstairs, grabbed my keys, and heard a noise downstairs. The cupboard door was opening. I didn't look. I ran out through the back door and got into my car. I called the police. When they arrived, they searched the cottage. Behind the storage door was a narrow, unfinished space beneath the stairs. Someone had been staying there. There was bedding, food, empty bottles, and a small opening leading to an old access tunnel behind the property. The police believed someone had been entering and leaving without using the main doors. I kept asking them the same question. Was he there when I left? Nobody could answer me. The person was gone. I never found out who it was. But I think about the coffee mug, the milk, the lights, the things I kept explaining away. And I think about my niece asking why the man was sleeping under the stairs. I had chosen that cottage because I wanted to be alone. Maybe I was. Maybe I wasn't. That's the problem. When you stay somewhere unfamiliar, you don't know what the house sounds like. You don't know where every door leads. You don't know who else has keys. And sometimes, the first sign that something is wrong is so small that you convince yourself it means nothing until you're no longer sure how long you've actually been sharing the space with someone else.